Agnes Fetterlock had weighed wool at that same scale for 30 years, first at Edmund's side and then, for 7 long winters, alone, and she knew before Walter Grendon's boots ever touched the frost-white cobbles of the market square that trouble was walking toward her. He came with 2 guild officers flanking him like hounds sent ahead of the hunt, and behind them trailed half a dozen merchants who had learned long ago that when Walter Grendon wanted an audience, it was wiser to provide one than to be seen refusing him. The morning was bright and bitterly cold, the kind of cold that turned every breath to smoke over the wool sacks piled high across the square, and Agnes had already weighed 4 parcels before the bells finished ringing for terce, each measure true to the last grain, because that was the only way she knew how to work a scale. Walter stopped before her table with the particular stillness of a man who has rehearsed his entrance and said, loudly enough for the whole square to hear, that he had come, for the good of the guild, to inspect the honesty of her weights before the staple men arrived from London to judge the town's wool for the year. Agnes, wiping her hands on her apron, told him he was welcome to inspect whatever he pleased, because her scales had never once cheated a soul, rich or poor, in all the years she had kept them. She said it plainly, without defiance, the way a woman says a thing she has said 100 times, because it happens to be true. And it was precisely that plainness, the absence of fear in her voice, that seemed to strike Walter like an insult he had not expected to receive. Before we go further with this story, I'd love to know which town or corner of the country you're watching from today. Leave the name of your city or town in the comments, because every story lands a little differently, depending on where a person is listening from it. Meanwhile, in the far corner of the market, near the wall where the wind bit least, a traveler in a plain gray cloak was weighing a small parcel of his own wool on the edge of Agnes's table, waiting his turn with the patience of a man in no particular hurry. No one had paid him much mind when he arrived before dawn, asking only for an honest weight and a fair price. And Agnes had given him both without a second glance, because in a market town a stranger's coin weighed the same as a neighbor's. The traveler watched Walter's approach with a stillness that did not match the idle curiosity of the other onlookers, his eyes moving from the alderman's face to Agnes's scale and back again, as though he were already weighing something far heavier than wool. Walter placed his own iron weight upon Agnes's scale, watched the balance settle, and declared, falsely, and to everyone's astonishment who had traded with her for years, that the beam sat crooked, that her measure ran short by a full ounce on every pound, and that such thievery, practiced quietly for years under the shelter of a dead man's good name, had likely cost the honest merchants of the town more silver than any of them could reckon. A murmur ran through the crowd, not of agreement, but of the particular silence that falls when people know a thing is a lie and are too frightened to say so aloud, because Walter Grendon held half the town's credit in his ledgers, and a man who crossed him in public rarely prospered afterward. Agnes felt the cold reach further into her chest than the morning air alone could account for, but she kept her hand steady on the edge of the table and said only that his weight was welcome to be checked against the guild's own standard measure, kept under seal in the very guild hall where he served as alderman. It was that answer, reasonable, calm, and impossible to argue against without revealing his own falsehood, that seemed to decide something in Walter Grendon that had been building for longer than that single morning. He seized the edge of Agnes's scale table and overturned it with both hands, sending the balance, the weights, and 3 carded fleeces tumbling across the frozen stones. And as the crowd gasped, he took hold of her wrist hard enough to bruise and shouted that she was a cheating widow, who had hidden behind Edmund Fetterlock's honest reputation for 7 years while robbing every merchant fool enough to trust a woman with a scale. He said he would see her royal license stripped from her before the staple inspectors arrived, that a market that tolerated thieves at its heart deserved no charter at all, and that the town had been patient with her out of pity for long enough. No one in that crowded square moved to stop him, though more than one face turned away rather than watch, because pity was a private thing and Walter Grendon's temper was not a debt any of them wished to collect. His wife Marjorie, who had stood near the edge of the crowd through all of it with her arms folded and her chin lifted, chose that moment to step forward and snatch Agnes's ledger from where it lay open on the upturned table. She flung it without a word into the brazier that warmed the fish seller's stall nearby, and the pages caught quickly, curling black at the edges before anyone thought to pull it free. And though Joan, Agnes's young apprentice, lunged forward with a cry and managed to drag the smoking book from the coals, half its pages were already lost. 7 years of honest reckoning turned to ash and smoke over a market square that had gone entirely silent. Agnes did not cry out. She knelt instead among her scattered wool, gathering the fleeces from the frost with hands that did not shake even now, because Edmund had taught her long ago that a woman who let her hands shake in front of men like Walter Grendon gave them exactly what they wanted to see. In the corner, the traveler in the gray cloak had gone very still. He had set down his own small weight the moment Walter's hand closed around Agnes's wrist, and he did not pick it up again. Beside him, 2 younger men who had arrived with him at dawn, men Agnes had taken for journeyman wool buyers, quiet and unremarkable, carrying themselves with the loose ease of ordinary travelers, exchanged a glance so brief that only someone watching closely would have caught it at all. Neither of them moved. Neither did the stranger. But something in the set of his shoulders and the particular quality of his silence suggested a man who had seen public humiliation before in his life and knew precisely how to tell the difference between a lie told with confidence and a truth offered without any need to prove itself. Reeve Thomas Aldercroft was not present in the square that morning, having been called to settle a boundary dispute at the far end of the parish, but his name was spoken more than once among the murmurs that followed Walter and his officers back toward the Guildhall, where they claimed rooms and demanded wine without any mention of payment. A wool buyer from the next county, warming his hands by a nearby stall, remarked quietly to his companion that he had seen the Grendons do something very like this to another wool house 2 market towns over, and that the widow there had lost her license within the month for lack of anyone brave enough to speak against an alderman. Agnes heard the remark, though it was not meant for her, and felt the ground of her own market square grow as uncertain beneath her feet as it had ever felt in 7 years of standing alone at that table. Joan knelt beside her, helping gather the last of the scattered wool, her young face white with an anger she had not yet learned to hide the way Agnes had. "You should send word to the Reeve tonight before Walter Grendon has time to twist the telling of it," she said in a low voice, using the name she had called Agnes since the day the older woman had taken her in off a shepherd's failing farm. Agnes shook her head and explained, brushing frost and wool dust from her apron, that accusing a guild alderman on the word of a widow alone, with her ledger burned and no other witness willing to speak, was like shouting into a winter wind. It cost the breath and moved nothing, and might well move things further backward. She reminded Joan, not for the first time, that the staple charters existed precisely to protect honest tradespeople from men like Walter, but that charters only worked when someone with real authority chose to enforce them, and in this town, Walter Grendon had more friends among the judges than enemies. It was then that Father Osric, who had been attending to a sick parishioner near the church and arrived only in time to see the tail end of the scene, came hurrying across the square with his robes gathered in one ink-stained hand, and his face flushed with an anger unusual for so gentle a man. The priest, who had known Edmund since before the wool house had a roof, took Agnes's cold hands in his own and told her quietly that he had heard enough from the churchyard wall to know this could not be allowed to stand, that royal charters existed exactly to guard honest merchants from precisely this kind of abuse, and that he himself had read the text of those charters more than once in the parish record chest. Agnes thanked him for the kindness, but asked him in the tired voice of a woman who had learned to choose her battles with care, to say nothing more that day, to let the market empty and the cold night bring what calm it could before anyone decided anything. The traveler in the gray cloak was the first to leave the square that morning, long before the last onlookers finished murmuring over what they had seen. He passed close by Agnes as she knelt gathering the last of her wool, and for a moment he paused. He said nothing of the humiliation he had just watched, offered no words of comfort she would not have known how to receive from a stranger. He only inclined his head, so slight a gesture it might have gone unnoticed by anyone not watching closely, and said in a low, even voice that hers had been the fairest scale he had traded on in a very long journey. Agnes, still kneeling among the frost and scattered fleece with her wrist aching where Walter had gripped it, managed only a small nod of thanks before the man turned and walked on, his two silent companions falling into step a few paces behind him, none of them having spoken more than a handful of words all morning. That night, when the wool house was finally quiet and the fire had burned low, Agnes sat alone with the ruined ledger in her lap, running her fingers over the blackened edges of pages that held 7 years of honest reckoning, now more ash than parchment. She looked up at the small carved figure of St. Blaise that Edmund had set above the hearth years before, patron of wool workers and of the trade that had fed and clothed them both, and she prayed quietly, not for vengeance, because that had never been her way of understanding faith, but for the strength to rise the next morning and set her scale straight again, because that was the only defense she had ever known how to offer the world. She did not yet know that in the small inn at the edge of town, the man in the gray cloak had spent much of that same night speaking low words to his two companions, and that before the sun rose again, he would make a decision that would change the fate of Agnes Fetterlock's wool house forever. When the gray light of morning crept through the shutters, Agnes was already awake, sweeping frost and stray wool fibers from the cobbles where her scale had been overturned the day before. It was Joan who discovered that the traveler in the gray cloak had already gone, his room at the small inn empty and paid in full, the bed made with a neatness that seemed at odds with a simple wool trader passing through. On the corner of Agnes's table, where he had weighed his parcel the morning before, sat a small lead token, left as though it were payment for a trade already settled. Agnes picked it up, thinking it nothing more than a stranger's modest thanks, a token worth less than the wool he had bought, and was nearly ready to hand it to Joan as a trinket for her apron pocket when something in its weight made her pause. It was Father Osric, arriving early to ask how Agnes had slept after the humiliation of the previous morning, who asked to see the token more closely, with the particular curiosity of a priest who had spent half his life poring over parish records and guild seals. He turned it toward the pale morning light coming through the window, ran his thumb across a small mark stamped into its face, a crown resting above a wool pack, and his weathered features went suddenly still. "Agnes," he said quietly, closing the door with his foot without setting the token down. "This is no ordinary traveler's mark. I have seen it only once before in my life, on a warrant that came through this parish years ago, sealed by the Crown's own staple authority." Agnes looked at him without fully understanding, her hands still dusted with the previous day's frost and ash, and felt something tighten in her chest that she could not yet name. Before either of them could say more, a firm knock sounded at the door, and Reeve Thomas Aldercroft entered with the uneasy look of a man carrying news he would rather not deliver. Agnes and the Reeve had known each other since childhood, and he had traded at her table more times than either could count. But that morning he came not as a neighbor, but as an officer of the law, a folded parchment tucked beneath his arm. He explained, avoiding her eyes more than was his habit, that Walter Grendon had lodged a formal accusation that very morning, charging her with short-weighing honest merchants for years under cover of her late husband's good name, and that a hearing date had been set in the guild hall ahead of the coming staple inspection for her to answer the charge before the town. "You know, I don't believe a word of what he's claiming," Thomas added, lowering his voice. "But a Reeve without witnesses willing to speak can do little more than call the hearing he's told to call." The news landed on Agnes like the second overturning of her table, this time without the sound of a scale crashing to stone, but with the same exact weight as the humiliation of the day before. Father Osric tried to offer comfort, reminding her of the royal charters that protected honest tradespeople. But Agnes, sitting once more by the cold hearth, answered with a calm that was not resignation, but the tiredness of years accumulated. "And who among those who watched yesterday will stand up in that hall and speak the truth against a man who can call in a debt or ruin a harvest with one word in the right ear?" Neither of them had an answer, because both knew the question had none that came easily, and because in that town, as in every town, fear of the powerful often weighed heavier than justice itself. And here it's worth pausing for a moment, because this story isn't only about Agnes, or a wool house, or a strange lead token with a mark no one could quite explain. It's about everyone who has kept a trade, a household, or a family honest through years of quiet, unglamorous work, only to be called a cheat by someone who never had to earn a single thing the hard way. In every age, there are those who mistake decency for weakness, and those who believe a hardworking woman's good name can be erased with a shout, a false ledger entry, or an accusation dressed up as concern for the guild. If you've ever watched a good, honest person treated as though they were worth nothing, stay with this story, because some truths take their time arriving. But when they do, they don't ask anyone's permission to take their rightful seat at the table. The days that followed carried a tension that could be felt even in the silence of the wool house at dawn. Walter Grendon, far from satisfied with the accusation already filed, spent his hours moving through the market and the tavern under the excuse of settling the town's confidence, though what he was in fact doing was buying silence and manufacturing testimony. He offered 2 of his own journeymen a fine sum to swear they had seen Agnes's scale run short in years past, and he let it be known to a cloth merchant who owed him a considerable debt that the debt might be quietly forgiven if the man's memory of Agnes's prices grew a little less generous. Under questioning, Reeve Thomas could do nothing to stop these conversations from happening, and each evening he came to the wool house with a graver face, reporting what he had heard without being able yet to act on any of it. It was Father Osric trying to help Agnes, who made the mistake that very nearly cost her everything. Convinced that the marked token might serve as real evidence, and not fully weighing the danger of loose talk in a small town, he mentioned to 2 trusted parishioners that Agnes was keeping some kind of token bearing a royal mark, which perhaps explained why a stranger had taken such an interest in her fortunes. The news, as it does in small towns, traveled faster than the mill stream and reached Walter Grendon's ears before the day was out. Rather than fear it, the alderman saw an opportunity. He arrived at the wool house the following morning with 2 of his officers, demanding to see this supposed relic, which the widow, he said with open contempt, had likely stolen from some unwary traveler to invent a protection she had no right to claim. Agnes, with the token hidden in the folds of her apron, denied having it at all, but Walter, emboldened by days without any answer from the hearing, went further than he ever had before. He threatened to take Joan into his own household as partial payment of the debts the widow owes my house, an invented debt no one had ever seen written down anywhere. The mere mention of the girl's name cracked something in the steadiness Agnes had kept until then. For the first time since Edmund's death, she felt willing to surrender anything, even that strange token that so troubled Father Osric, rather than let Joan suffer beneath a roof where cruelty wore the clothes of respectability. That very evening, hands trembling, she came close to throwing the token into Walter's own fire when he returned to demand it, thinking that destroying it once and for all might end the danger altogether. It was Joan who stopped her, gripping her wrists with a strength that surprised even Agnes herself, reminding her through tears she rarely allowed to fall that her adopted father, Edmund, would never have destroyed something he didn't understand out of fear, but would have kept it safe until its worth became clear. Moved by the girl's steadiness, Agnes hid the token instead in the small hollow carved beneath the base of the wooden figure of Saint Blaise above the hearth, the same place where Edmund had once kept the deed to the wool house, trusting that no man, however proud, would think to search a saint's carved figure for a beggar's trinket. That night, setting the figure back in its place, she prayed again, not for strength this time, but for understanding, wondering quietly what kind of object it could be that had made a 59-year-old priest go pale with a single glance. The day before the hearing arrived, wrapped in a hard frost that silvered every rooftop and turned the breath of the whole town white in the cold morning air. Reeve Thomas came to the wool house at dusk with the look of a man who had already lost a fight he had not yet fought, and admitted to Agnes that Walter's paid witnesses were ready to testify the next morning, that the guild itself had come under pressure from other merchants eager to settle the matter quickly before the staple inspectors arrived, and that he, as Reeve, lacked the authority to dismiss the charge without clear evidence in her favor. Father Osric, seated by the fire with his face aged overnight by worry, admitted that the parish record could confirm only that a traveling wool trader had lodged in town that week, but that a simple entry of lodging, alone, would never be enough to overturn the sworn word of a guild alderman backed by convincing, if false, witnesses. That night, for the first time since Edmund's death, Agnes felt that the wool house they had built together, measure by honest measure, might truly be lost. Not through any fault or dishonesty of her own, but through the simple difference in weight between a guild chain of office and a widow with nothing to offer but her word. She sat by the hearth, looking at the carved figure of St. Blaise that held within it the secret of the marked token, and for the first time in years let the tears come without trying to stop them. Not from anger at Walter Grendon, but from the deep exhaustion of a woman who had fought alone for far too long. Joan sat beside her without a word, and Father Osric, from the other side of the fire, murmured a quiet prayer that sounded more like company than comfort, because he knew that words, that night, were no longer enough for anything. It was well into the night, when the fire had burned down to embers and the town lay silent beneath the frost, that the sound of hooves and slow, deliberate footsteps carried up the lane toward the wool house. Joan, still awake, looked out from the upper window and saw, through the pale moonlight, two cloaked figures stop before the shuttered door of the wool house, asking a passing townsman, in low but steady voices, after the widow, Agnes Fetterlock. They did not carry themselves with the tired gait of ordinary travelers, nor the light baggage of men on a simple errand. They moved with the quiet discipline of men trained not to draw attention, and yet, for anyone watching closely, it was impossible not to notice that something about them did not quite match two simple wool buyers lost in the frost of a winter night. The bell of the parish church rang out the hour just past midday, calling the guild hall to session, and by the time Agnes crossed the frosted square toward its heavy oak doors, the frost had begun to melt into a thin silver sheen under a pale winter sun. Joan had sewn her a fresh apron that very morning in near silence, and Agnes wore it now with her back straight, though each step felt weighted, as if stones had been sewn into her hem. Reeve Thomas already stood near the entrance with Walter's accusation in hand, and beside him, with the contained smile of a man who believes himself already victorious, waited Walter Grendon, dressed in his finest burgundy gown, as though the hearing were merely another occasion to display his guild chain of office. Marjorie stood at his side, and behind them the two paid journeymen and the indebted cloth merchant, none of them quite able to meet the eyes of the townsfolk filling the hall. The guild hall filled quickly with merchants, weavers, and the same townsfolk who had watched the humiliation in the market days before, summoned by Reeve Thomas as witnesses to the general character of the dispute, if not to the specific facts now under judgment. Thomas opened the proceedings by reading Walter's charge aloud. Short weighing, fraud, and deceit practiced against honest merchants under cover of a dead man's good name, against the person of Agnes Fetterlock, widow, keeper of the wool house. Walter spoke first with the easy eloquence of a man who had spent his life being listened to in guild chambers, painting a polished picture in which he and his officers had merely sought to protect the town's honest trade from a woman who had grown rich for years, cheating the poor and the trusting alike. He offered the testimony of his two journeymen, who swore under oath to have seen her scale run short on more than one occasion, and that of the cloth merchant who claimed to have been overcharged, though he could not prove it in writing, only recall it clearly. Agnes listened to all of it with her hands folded before her, never once lowering her eyes, while the silence of the hall closed around her like water over a stone, sinking slowly to the bottom. When her turn came to speak, she had only her own word and that of Father Osric, who stepped forward with the parish record book beneath his arm, and explained to the assembly that the week in question showed an entry for the lodging of a traveling wool trader, whose stay coincided exactly with the humiliation now under dispute, though the priest could not say who the man had truly been, or why his presence should matter to the case at hand. Walter smiled with open contempt and asked the hall, in the voice of a man who has already won, what manner of proof that was. A record book in which any priest might write any name he pleased, against the sworn word of two honest men and a respectable merchant of the town. A murmur of doubt moved through the room, and Agnes felt with total clarity for the first time that she was about to lose everything that same afternoon. It was at that very moment, just as Reeve Thomas prepared to call for the guild's deliberation, that a stir rose among the townsfolk gathered near the hall's great doors. Two cloaked men, the same who had asked after the widow Agnes Fetterlock's wool house through the frost the night before, stepped forward through the crowd without hurry, and behind them, walking with the same unhurried, deliberate stride he had worn in the corner of the market days earlier, came the traveler in the plain gray cloak. Thomas, startled, demanded to know who they were and by what right they interrupted a lawful hearing, and it was then that one of the two men, drawing back the edge of his cloak, revealed beneath it a doublet bearing an emblem that half the hall recognized at once, though none of them had ever expected to see it worn in such plain disguise. The mark of the Crown's own staple authority. The silence that fell over the Guildhall was unlike any silence that had come before it. Not the uncomfortable hush of people afraid to speak, but the complete stillness of a room realizing, all at once, that it had been standing inside a far larger story than any of them had understood. The man who had shown the emblem unrolled a sealed warrant and held it high for the hall to see before reading it aloud. A royal writ, invoking the staple charters that protected honest wool merchants and weighers throughout the kingdom, and commanding that full authority be given to the testimony of any person present who had been direct witness to an offense committed against a licensed keeper of the scales. Walter Grendon, who until that instant had worn the confident smile of a man already victorious, felt something cold climb up his spine, though he did not yet grasp the full weight of what was coming. The traveler in the gray cloak stepped forward, and it was the officer beside him who spoke, in a voice that allowed no doubt, declaring to the entire assembly that this man was no ordinary wool trader but the king's own wool warden, traveling in disguise to inspect the honesty of staple towns ahead of the Crown's yearly assessment, and that he had personally witnessed, with his own eyes, everything that had occurred in the market square the morning Walter Grendon overturned Agnes Fetterlock's scale, burned her ledger, and called honest a name a cheat before the whole town. A collective gasp swept through the hall. Marjorie went pale and stepped back as though the floor beneath her had shifted, and the two paid journeymen dropped their eyes, no longer able to hold the lie they had sworn to only minutes before. The warden spoke then in his own voice, grave and even, the same voice Agnes remembered thanking her for the fairest scale he had traded on in a long journey. He told the hall plainly what he had seen, a widow who had weighed the same honest measure for a stranger in a worn cloak as she had for any wealthy merchant, and a guild alderman who had answered that honesty by overturning a table, burning a ledger, and threatening to destroy a widow's livelihood for the simple pleasure of feeling powerful before his own men. "I traded on her scale myself that morning," he said, "and found in her measure no less honesty than any man owes another, and far more than I have found in many a Guildhall since." He drew from beneath his cloak a second lead token, twin to the one hidden inside the carved figure of St. Blaise, bearing the same stamped mark, and instructed one of his men to fetch the one he himself had left on her counter that frosty dawn. Father Osric, his ink-stained hands trembling with an emotion he had not felt in years, hurried from the hall with Joan at his side, and returned soon after carrying the carved figure of St. Blaise, from whose base he drew, before the eyes of the entire assembly, the token Agnes had hidden there in fear of losing it. The warden's officer took it, compared it against the mark set in the ring he wore on his own hand, and confirmed before the merchants, weavers, and townsfolk gathered that it was, beyond any doubt, the mark of the Crown's own staple authority, given only to those the king's officers wished to honor with their trust. In that moment, the lie so carefully built by Walter Grendon did not fall all at once, but crumbled the way an old wall gives way, stone by stone. The cloth merchant, seeing which way the wind had turned, stammered a confession that he had been pressured with the threat of a called debt into speaking against the widow, and the two journeymen, trembling now before the Crown's own authority, admitted they had been paid to swear falsely. Walter Grendon, seeing himself exposed before the very town that had stayed silent out of fear days earlier, tried still to hold his ground, insisting that no man could prove with certainty the identity of a disguised traveler. But the warden, with a calm far more devastating than any shout, ordered that since the hall was already assembled, an inquiry be opened into complaints other wool houses along the Staple Road had lodged against the Grendon name in years past, complaints no one had dared carry further than whispered talk between wool keepers, and which one of his officers confirmed having already gathered in two other staple towns on this same journey. The truth, which until then had advanced only in small blows, opened wide at last. Walter Grendon had not only humiliated Agnes that frosty morning, but had spent years walking the wool trade like a man owed tribute he had no right to collect, protected only by the fear his guild chain inspired in those who depended on the goodwill of the powerful to survive. The hall, with the authority of the royal warrant invoking staple law, delivered judgment that same afternoon, before the same witnesses who had seen both the humiliation and its undoing. Walter Grendon was stripped of his guild office and his alderman's chain, ordered to repay from his own estate triple the value of the ledger and goods he had destroyed, and was barred, by the crown's own authority, from holding any staple license or guild rank for the remainder of his life. The deepest disgrace a wool merchant could suffer in a staple town, for no honest house would ever trade with him again. Marjorie, who had flung Agnes's ledger into the brazier, was ordered to replace it with a new one, copied in her own hand from what fragments could still be read. A lesser justice the hall judged necessary all the same, so the town would see that even the smallest cruelties had not gone unanswered. When the moment came for Walter to make his public acknowledgement, he crossed the square to the wool house, followed by the eyes of the entire town, and there, compelled by the sentence but reached, perhaps for the first time in his life, by something resembling real shame, he knelt on the cold stones before Agnes and spoke the words the hall had ordered him to say, that he had lied, that the keeper of the wool house was an honest woman, and that he asked pardon before God and before the town for the wrong he had done her. Agnes looked at him a long moment, without hurry, with the same steadiness that had carried her through the whole ordeal, and rather than turn away or leave him kneeling, as he had once left her humiliated on the cobbles, she extended her hand and helped him to his feet, a gesture that caught more than one onlooker by surprise. Then, without a word, she went inside and returned with a small weight of wool from her own stock and set it before him on the mended table. "Every honest measure is paid for in this house," Agnes said, echoing the plain words that had first set his temper alight days before. "And today, sir, you will pay it in full." Walter took the wool with hands that no longer carried the certainty of a man sure of his own superiority, settled his debt before the watching town, and left upon the counter, this time in truth, the full payment owed for what he had destroyed, along with the triple sum ordered by the hall. The warden, who had watched the entire scene from a quiet place near the guild hall door, approached Agnes once more before continuing on his journey, and placed in her hands a sealed royal warrant, written protection for the wool house, commanding any officer of the crown to guard Agnes Fetterlock and her scale from future harm, in memory, the warrant said, of the morning a widow had weighed wool fairly for a stranger who turned out to be the king's own man. That evening, when the town had settled back into its ordinary quiet and the fire burned low and warm once more in the wool house hearth, Agnes hung the royal warrant beside the carved figure of Saint Blaise, and on the mantel beside it, she set the two lead tokens side by side. The one the warden had left as payment that first frosty morning, and the one he had pressed into her hands at their parting, twins both, stamped with the crown above the wool pack. Father Osric, seated by the fire with Joan, remarked quietly that he had rarely in his life seen Providence work so plainly through the hands of ordinary people, without need of any miracle at all, only the memory of a grateful king's man and the stubborn honesty of a woman who had never once asked for anything in return for measuring fairly. Agnes, watching the two tokens catch the low firelight, felt for the first time in 7 years of widowhood that the weight on her shoulders had eased, not because she had triumphed over Walter Grendon, but because the whole town had finally seen what she had always known quietly within herself, that honesty is not measured by the name a person carries, but by the fairness of the scale they hold out to whoever stands before them, be they beggar or king. If this story reminded you of a woman who kept a trade, a household, or a family honest through years of quiet work, write her name in the comments, if only so someone else might read it with the respect it deserves.